Hello, friends. Welcome to another Friends of Park County podcast. In this episode, we'll be discussing citizen initiated zoning, a provision in Montana statutes that allows citizens to come together in their area to create a land use plan and regulations to protect what they value. This is different than county initiated zoning, in which the county is in charge of the process. I'm Randy Carpenter, Executive Director of Friends of Park County. Friends of Park County is focused on a single issue: managing the growth in Park County and doing it in a way that protects the awesome assets that we enjoy here. Our guest today is Maggie McGuane from the Suce Creek area, where neighbors in that drainage came together to create their own zoning district. Welcome, Maggie.
Hi there.
Maggie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a native of Park County, raised two children here in Park County. Both went to Park High School. Like you said, I'm a resident of Suce Creek. And my background is actually not in anything to do with zoning or those adjacent areas. I have specialized in disaster response for the last couple of decades. Before that, I worked as a journalist and really stumbled into this issue because of some changes facing the residents of Suce Creek.
Yeah, so if you could just dive right into it. So, what really did motivate you and your neighbors to work together on this zoning district? I mean, what were the changes in the Suce Creek area?
Well, we were alerted to a proposed development, a large commercial development on Suce Creek. And so we came together as neighbors, alarmed at what the possible impacts were. And what I found immediately was a not only a neighborhood, but in my opinion, a county full of very different ideas about growth, and residents who hadn't sort of started a healthy neighborly dialogue about how we all feel about these things. Um, and so, what I found first and foremost is a neighborhood that really needed to come together and get on the same page.
Yeah. Um, but you guys did this whole process, in a really short period of time, compared to, the other citizen initiated zoning districts, which I'm familiar, and that's a lot of them. Um, so, if you could just kind of take us through the process, of how you did that, how you brought neighbors together to come to agreement, and, how did you get it done so quickly?
Well, the timeline was short, the hours put in were long.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but we came together as a neighborhood, and I'll tell you something, and I feel pretty passionately about this for Park County. Um, I sort of worked as conduit and facilitator. And what we decided first and foremost is we weren't going to get stuck in ruts with sort of like impenetrable notions about what should and shouldn't happen on Suce Creek.
Okay.
So there were no battles in the neighborhood. The battle was to find basics that we agreed upon and then work toward that basic. And so I think that that is something that I really hope other neighborhoods in Park County look at. In other words, I didn't come in there and say this is absolutely what Suce Creek needs to look like in 30 years, and I'm going to try to win you over. We really had a conversation about what worked for everyone. And in my opinion, that's how it's going to get done throughout the state, is finding common ground instead of getting on a high horse and sticking to it.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like we worked through a lot as a neighborhood just through constant neighborhood meetings, communication, and and really prioritizing flexibility, making sure that we, for us, we landed on one very specific goal, which is this is not an appropriate neighborhood for industrial commercial endeavors. Very simple.
Yeah.
And we didn't try to add to that. We didn't try to, we all agreed on that. And that was a very attainable goal for us.
So, what were some of the primary challenges in making this happen?
Some of the primary challenges were very basic, but since the last CIZD in Park County, a lot has changed. Airbnb has become an issue. Um, there's changes in legal marijuana cultivation, all of these kinds of things that we had to build in language around. And again, because we weren't interested in regulating much else besides, big commercial endeavors, we built in protections for property owners so that they could have vacation rentals, so that we did all agree on some fundamentals, but mostly we agreed on what kind of activity we wanted to protect and encourage. And a lot of that was, making sure that our agricultural producers on this drainage were protected, making sure that property rights were protected. Um, we focused on what we were encouraging and allowing in instead of what we were banning and keeping out.
Hmm. Um, and like, how long did it take exactly? And when did you start this? And I know that there was a first reading, a first hearing of the zoning district before the commissioners just a couple weeks ago or a week ago. But when did you start it?
We started this process pretty immediately about this fall, but we started sort of addressing the issue in a multi-pronged approach. So
Okay.
we looked into conservation easements. We looked into making conservation purchases of a 90-acre piece of property that was the piece of property proposed for development. We sort of explored all of the options, including free market options available to us here on Suce Creek. And I think that's really important.
Sure.
We tried everything. What are all of the ways that we as property owners can protect a residential and agricultural way of life here on Suce Creek? So we didn't go straight to zoning. We
Yeah.
we did everything at once.
Really smart.
Um,
Yeah.
and that was really helpful because I had so many neighbors active in this pursuit. So some neighbors formed a committee looking at conservation purchases. Some, I worked with some other neighbors on looking at CIZDs. We did a sort of all at once, how do we save Suce Creek? And people put in a lot of long, hard hours until essentially, like any process, sort of everything gets filtered out. Well, that didn't work. This didn't work. And what we were left with was the option of a citizens initiated zoning district. Um, and in embarking on that process, we right away concluded that although a 60% majority is required, we
Right.
weren't aiming for 60%. We were aiming for getting everybody on board. That was our mission. We didn't want to shove down other residents' throats something they weren't interested in participating. And again, it came back to coming together as a neighborhood. What do we all want? What do we all agree on? Um, and I think in many ways that expedited the process. Yes, it was hard. It was talking through a lot of things. It was a lot of people making compromises. But how can we compromise and communicate down to a document that everybody feels good about presenting to the commission?
And what was that, if you can put a fine point on what everybody could agree on? That is, what did they want Suce Creek to be like in the future and maybe not to be like in the future?
Very, very simple. We wanted this to be a residential and agricultural zone,
Okay.
and not a commercial district.
Hmm.
Very
Yeah.
basic. Um, that, one thing that I think people, battle over is what kind of view sheds, what kind of other
Sure.
protections.
Yep.
We were not interested in battling over those things. We were interested in simply maintaining this as an agricultural and residential district and not a commercial zone.
So pretty much everybody agreed then that they didn't want this to be an area with large scale commercial uses.
Exactly.
Yeah, cool. Um,
Exactly. Now, it's interesting because, you get into the finer points on this. And again, like I brought up, Airbnbs, what other
yeah,
kinds of commercial activity
yeah,
are we okay with? And
yeah,
we zoned that in. We were not interested in preventing people from having home businesses.
yeah.
Um, from having other structures on their property. We were hyper focused on the very basics, and that allowed for, and it required a lot of communication, um and but it allowed for a very streamlined, focused focused agenda.
Cool. So if someone, you mentioned that agriculture, of course, would be allowed. Um, and if someone wanted to start a small home-based business, let's say a small printing business or something like that in their shop, um, that that is allowed. Is that right?
That is allowed, absolutely.
Yeah.
If a resident here on Suce Creek wants to have a home business, that is quite all right with us. We were not interested in overreach in any way, even though I think it's important to note it's not like we all came from the same background and the same set of opinions. Pretty easy to look at me and assess that I'm somebody who would love everything to be hyper protected and no change at all. Well, that's
Yeah.
that's not feasible now. So we came from very different perspectives again, and just found, what do we all agree on? Let's, and egregious commercial growth was not in our best interest.
Now, I found in these processes that bringing neighbors together is clearly necessary, as you're saying. Um, but there needs to be somebody or a smaller group of people to make that happen. It just doesn't happen on its own. So, who did that?
I did that. So we hosted the meetings at my house, and in
Okay.
some ways some of those things come out naturally. Who has the time to take it on? Who
Yeah.
doesn't? We wanted to make sure that nobody was left out of the process. Everybody felt welcome. And so it was a very inclusive process. But we wanted to make sure that people who, for instance, couldn't participate in sharing the legal fees, we had to use a lawyer, as one does in crafting the CIZD. We wanted to make sure that they weren't given any less of a voice. That was very important to me. I think that some of the bad rap and some of the divisions that have happened around Park County are based on the haves and have-nots, and the
Yeah.
haves thinking there should be the only voice that counts. I believe the have-nots, or the, less politically active, sitting on boards, whatever, we should all be equal in this. And so I was very firm in making sure that did not alter how much of a voice people had, and they could participate to whatever extent they wanted, but their opinion and what they wanted mattered equally.
Yeah, that's something that has come through again and again in my career as a planner, 30 some years, which is oftentimes people can agree to disagree and they can find some compromise. Um, but people want their voice heard. I mean, they want to be heard, and if they don't feel like they're being heard, um, that's just going to lead to problems down the road and can make the process, really rocky. So what I'm hearing from you,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that what we've seen, for me as a Livingston native, we've seen this sort of natural assumption with wealthier people coming into the area that, they have more of a voice. Their property is more valuable. They're, paying for a bigger portion of the attorney, whatever it is. Sometimes the natural assumption is, so I get a bigger say. Um and we didn't allow that. We all agreed as a community, everybody got equal say in this. And I think that, part of that was helped by the fact that I'm a little fierce and pretty bossy, and didn't have a hard time, not that I needed to in our case, but as I see it countywide, I hope to be a voice in telling some of those people who assume they should be heard louder to tell them to stand down. We are all residents of Park County. We all have to agree on what we want this place to look like, or at least find some base level values.
So what resources, you know, uh, in terms of planning, uh, advice, in terms of legal? I mean, these things aren't really that legally complex, but still, I mean, you have to follow certain procedures in order for it to be legal. And what sort of financial resources were required?
So, first of all, first thing we did was ask the people in the county a lot of questions. Tell us about other CIZDs, tell us what's
Okay.
worked, what hasn't worked.
Yeah.
Um, Tell us what is enforceable from a county perspective. Um, we did use an attorney, and so, the entire neighborhood basically got an email saying, does anyone want to, who could help, who can chip in to use an attorney? And so some of the neighbors said, I'm in a position to help. Some said, I'm not right now. And that was fine. No pressure in those directions. I spoke to planners all around the state.
Ah,
I read CIZDs all around the state and then followed up with, has this worked? Has this faced a lot of legal challenges? um what would make this more enforceable? What kinds of things have come up in Park County that were points of contention that weren't or were included in CIZDs? What should we avoid? And what I found was a lot of people, really eager to give their perspective, tell us their experience. A lot of it just comes down to picking up the phone, cold calling people. Hey, I live in Suce Creek. Here's what we're facing. You guys have a CIZD. How has it worked? What are the complaints on that one? Um, Really, just mostly, again, coming down to communication.
yeah. And
And
for
by
the
the way, I
audience,
say that with the CIZD, but we approached every angle that way. Hey, have you gotten neighbors to get together on conservation easements? How did that work out for you? Have you leaned into deed restrictions? What places have had successes and failures, and what does that look like?
yeah. And for the audience, real quickly, a CIZD is a citizen initiated zoning district. That's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Maggie, was the county staff available to help you?
They were. I have really loved the staff in Park County, like just their openness to taking the time to answer my questions. Really, really had wonderful help from them, and I've been, really, really appreciative of the county being helpful in. Obviously, they can't, be proponents of ours, but they can tell me where to look. They can give me, copies of existing CIZDs. They were wonderful that way. And that was really helpful.
Yeah. And So the process is that you put together, I think what statute calls a neighborhood plan, sort of a land use plan,
Yep.
that is not the regulations, and then you implement that land use plan or neighborhood plan with the actual regulations themselves. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. And how did in doing this, you put together all of that, and you have to get, you said 60% of the property owners within the boundaries of this zoning district to sign a petition in support of it. You
Yes.
mentioned that you got a higher level than 60%, the 60% threshold that is required by statute. Um, and then you then take it to the county commissioners and the county planning and zoning commission. And so a couple questions out of that. Um, what level of support did you get? A percentage of landowners who would sign on the petition. Again, 60% is required. And how then did the county commissioners uh, receive this? Did they accept this? Did they have a lot of questions? Did they struggle with this whole process of, after all, they're the ones that have to vote to adopt it?
So, first of all, one thing that I didn't understand when I undertook this is the petition, the word petition is sort of makes one think it was just a matter of like getting a piece of paper and,
Yeah.
going around and having people sign it. For each person who participated, they had a fair amount of legwork they had to do themselves. And so each participant had to, provide documents about their property ownership. If they had that ownership in an LLC or a trust, we had to have those documents provided to us. Then they had to have a notarized signature. So that in and of itself is relatively in depth. We reached 85% participation. Um, and worth noting that that includes our district goes up and over the hill um, on the south boundary of Suce Creek. So we go all the way basically to Indian Hill. Uh, and so some of the, we have 85%, but don't take that as 15% didn't want to participate. In some cases, as we know now around Park County, people own properties who don't live here, were
Yeah.
impossible to get in touch with. And we still reached 85%, which I think is pretty darn remarkable.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
the commissioners were very pleased with that level of participation. And we got unanimous yay to approve the petition.
Well, that's fantastic. So all three commissioners voted to, at least the first reading, to adopt this zoning district. All three of them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
And 85%, man, that's got to be some record. I wish someone would do, an academic would do some research on how this has worked out now after 40 or so years, 50 years of these citizen initiated zoning districts. Um, but if they did that, I got to believe that 85% might be a record high, just for the reason that you mentioned, that you're just not going to be able to reach 100%,
yep.
because they don't live there, et cetera. And sometimes ownership can be, it's not always so straightforward as, one owner on the deed. So, just a fantastic level of support there. That's almost
When I have a
unbelievable.
little more free time, I really look forward to doing some kind of a deep dive. I have gassed and said as much to many people. I think we set a record, but I'd like to make that record official.
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to see that too. I mean, usually you get that many people together, you can't agree on what to have for lunch,
Yes.
let alone agree on the essential, nature of what they'd like the future to be and agree on actual regulations that would affect their property and
Yep,
everyone else's property, of course.
exactly. And,
Mm.
I really think it's important to look at these um, citizens initiated zoning districts as an assertion of property owners' rights.
Yeah.
We as a neighborhood asserted our right to to have participation in the future of this neighborhood and have a vision and execute it accordingly. And I think that the reason we had such high participation is because everyone recognized that this was how we protected our rights as property owners. One thing in embarking on this that's important to note is it makes you very aware of issues facing a neighborhood when there lack, countywide um, uh, planning essentially. And so what we really had to look at was uh, the safety issues brought in by large scale commercial development. We live in a fire zone. Does this increase our risk of fires? Well, the answer is absolutely. When you have, any kind of increased traffic. And in our case, really looking at the fact that we are, prime for big sort of tourist focused things. Well, we know, and I did a fair amount of research on this, how much a big influx of out of state visitors increases safety risks. So we looked at all of that. And boy, oh boy, I hope everyone in Park County looks at that, considering how much our population booms in the summer. You're talking about people who are not savvy to what it means to live in a high fire risk zone, what it means to live in a place that, obviously we have issues in the winter with our roads, et cetera. And we had to look at all of that and think about how that would impact us. Um, and those are things that ultimately the county is going to have to tackle. But for us, in the meantime, we had to tackle it ourselves. We don't want, people who haven't driven on rural roads racing up and down. We don't want the possibility of bars and restaurants where you have a lot of intoxicated people on a rural road with limited, sheriff's department availability. Like these were very important risks that we needed to address.
Maggie, you talk about, how thorough it seems to me this process was. And to me, it's admirable. And it just seems like that, this was one neighborhood, one drainage. Um, but just think that this process would be a pretty good model for throughout the county. And that's not just in land use. It can be for, disaster preparation, et cetera. Um, and that process of bringing people together, making sure their voices are heard, and not taking any shortcuts in that. There's a model for
Mhm.
planning on a larger scale, for all sorts of issues in the future. Does that ring true to you?
Completely. I mean, and I, have to anyone who will listen, I have offered myself as a, giving, I would love to give tutorials on talking to and listening to your neighbors because we are facing so much. We are facing, limited resources in emergency response, in road repair, in all of these things. And I think a lot of the time, what we have to do is learn to get out of our own way, whatever it is we're hyper focused on, and listen to our neighbors. What are their concerns? Um, and start to really build a community around common concerns and common values, even if they're not something that is a priority. It's interesting. Some people, for me, as I said, I've worked in disaster, so I'm always looking at safety issues. That wasn't something that had occurred to some neighbors. Some neighbors were more interested in conservation issues. But let's all get together and talk about these things and figure out what's going to impact not only our quality of life, but our property values together.
Yeah, yeah. Good point. Um, well, Maggie, just thank you so much, for leading this process and showing not just your neighbors, but hopefully people throughout the county, how this can be done. Um, and so I really, admire your tenacity that was
Thank you.
required to get this done. And and of course, congratulations. And do you have any final words?
I think that ultimately, if we start by thinking about being good neighbors to each other and being part of a community, a lot of these things will come naturally.
I love it. I love it. Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. And for our audience, we'd appreciate it if you make sure you like and subscribe to us on social media, friendsofparkcounty.org. You can find this podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, we'd like to thank our supporters who make our work possible. We are deeply grateful. And Maggie, we're grateful for you and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. You take care.
Take care.